guys, it's Erin, and today I want to talk to you about poetry. I've noticed on Instagram and in some other places people have been talking about how they want to read more poems, but they're not really sure where to start and what to start with. And I think poetry is kind of, it can be kind of a scary topic for people because we overcomplicate things in high school, like way too much. As a high school teacher, I've certainly been guilty of this before I kind of started to realize, like, poetry is actually one of the most basic forms of writing in any culture. If you look back, the further back you go, the more likely it is that pretty much everything that is creative, as opposed to like didactic, like teaching, like nonfiction, is written in verse. And that was for a variety of reasons, but mostly because I think we just like stuff in verse. Songs are basically poems, and if you approach poetry with just the attitude of it's a song as opposed to I have to like dig through this to unearth some complicated meaning, I think that helps a lot. So this video is going to have basically three parts. I'm going to talk a little bit about some poets that I like, first contemporary poets, and then classic poets, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about just reading poetry and how you can find the kind of poems that are interesting to you. Because just like fiction or nonfiction, there's all kinds of different kinds of poetry, and so one of the keys is to finding the kind that you like, because some people don't like certain kinds of fiction, for example, and so if you decide to only read that kind of poetry and it's the kind that you don't like, then you're gonna think that you don't like poetry, but it's actually just that genre. First, the contemporary poet recommendations. I'm drawn to poetry that's a little bit more not introspective but reflective on life, and I really like poetry that is reflective about nature. My recommendations are kind of more heavily skewed towards that, especially with contemporary poetry. The first of these is Mary Oliver. I don't actually have a collection of Mary Oliver's poetry. I have a collection of her essays, which is really beautiful, but I don't have a collection of her poetry. Mary Oliver is that style of contemporary poet that I really like. She's warm, she's gentle, she's thoughtful. Her thoughts sometimes are a little bit provocative, and that they push you to reconsider what you think about the world, which I think is really valuable. She does this in her essays too. She thinks about nature and our relationship to nature, and she also reflects on a lot of other topics. And even when I feel like she's pushing on some of my beliefs and trying to get me to think differently about a subject, I always come away feeling a little bit lighter, a little bit kind of soothed. I think one of her most famous poems is called The Wild Geese, and you can probably just Google that and read it if you're interested. The next poet is one I just recently discovered, and that is Wendell Berry. I've heard about Wendell Berry for a long time, but I never actually sat down and read any of his poetry until I was at a retreat in October, and like literally everybody I talked to was like, Wendell Berry, and so I was like, fine, I'll read his stuff. And then I loved it. Berry's poetry is also very much in the same vein as Mary Oliver's. He lives in rural Kentucky and writes about his experiences there, his thoughts, his family. This volume of poetry has like a little verse drama in it that explores the lifelong love of a couple that kind of lingers even after they die. It's really beautiful. And again, his poetry is just so warm and generous, and also kind of pushes you to think a little bit about slowing down, easing into life a little bit more, maybe not being quite so driven to be like successful, because what does that really mean? Stuff like that. I really like this particular volume of his poetry, but any of them I think would be excellent, and there is a collected works of his available. That's also a good way to just like own everything that the poet wrote. A third contemporary recommendation is Billy Collins's Ballistics. Or really just anything that Billy Collins writes. I have a couple of volumes of his poetry, and I've read actually a lot of his poems. He's probably the contemporary poet that I've read the most of, and I really like his poetry. His is a little less nature-based, although he still thinks about nature sometimes. He just writes about life. There's a poem in this volume called Divorce, which is really interesting. He has a poem called Bathtub Families. There's another one that titles a different collection of his poetry that's called Sailing Aimlessly Around the Room. There's another one that's called Hippos on Holiday. I don't know. He just writes about random stuff, and his poetry is maybe a little bit more whimsical sometimes than Mary Oliver or Wendell Berry's, at least as far as like I've read. And it's less rural, it's less nature-based, so if that's not your thing, maybe try Billy Collins. Billy Collins's poetry is really easily available to read online, a lot of it. He also put together something called, I think the 180 Project, and there's collections of poetry, but also a website. If you Google Billy Collins and 180, it'll probably come up. But basically the idea was to help kids become more exposed to poetry by putting together a collection of poems that could be read out loud each day. So there's 180 of them because there's usually 180 days of school, and those are all available online. So if you want to try like a whole bunch of contemporary poets, that is a great place to go check out. Okay, section 2 is classic poets. So these are poets who wrote like more than 50 years ago. They're probably dead. And so I will say at the beginning of this section, if you have never read poetry before, or if your last experience with poetry was a kind of negative one from school or something, be careful with the classic poets that you pick, because some of them are really challenging, and they were challenging on purpose. I feel like the contemporary poets that I recommended, all of their poetry is really accessible. You can read the poem and you kind of understand what the poet is getting at. Classic poetry is sometimes much more complex. So this is a case where picking up one of the big names, you actually could go wrong. The poets that I am recommending are poets that I feel like that I either really, really love or that I feel like are a little bit more accessible. And when I say accessible for poetry, what I mean is that you can pick up a poem, and if you read it, you understand what the author is trying to tell you. Sometimes it's just, hey, let's think about how this tree is really pretty, or Wordsworth wrote a poem about daffodils that I really like, which basically the summary, it's a beautiful poem, but the summary of it is, I was walking around and then I crested a hill and there was this entire field of daffodils, and it was glorious, and I still think about it sometimes. A lot of times that's what poets are doing. They're just sharing experiences with you, and they're using really beautiful language to do it. But like I said, sometimes they're not doing that, and that can make things a little bit harder to get into. So save those poets for when you're a little bit more familiar with reading poetry. So the first poet that I'm going to recommend is kind of a transitional one. He sort of feels more like a contemporary poet sometimes, but isn't, and that is Robert Frost. Frost is again, he's like a nature poet. One of my favorite poems of his is called it's called Birches, which is really lovely. There's another one called Mending, which I really like, and a lot of his poetry is available online again, so you can check those out if you're interested. I don't actually have a collection of Frost's poetry, despite him being one of my favorite poets. I don't have a ton of collections of poetry. A lot of the poems that I have read have been poems that I have taught, so they are in books of like textbooks and stuff. I'm kind of gonna move backwards in time, and first we have the marvelous Gerard Manley Hopkins. Hopkins is definitely one of my favorite poets, and again, he writes a lot about nature. I am sensing a theme here. I'm sorry for all of the nature poetry recommendations. Maybe I should read outside my comfort zone. Oops. Hopkins writes really stunning poetry. He often reflects on nature, again, like I said, and his poetry is more formal, which means it has a rhyme scheme. It might be written in a particular kind of poetic form, like a sonnet. But I think that the form really just lends to the beauty of Hopkins's poetry. And while what he's kind of saying, or the images that he's sharing, are comprehensible, his language is incredibly dense and lush and beautiful. So if you really like language and writers who write really beautiful sentences, I would highly recommend Hopkins. Elizabeth Barrett Browning is another great poet. Her sonnet sequence, Sonnets from the Portuguese, is a really beautiful sequence. She was a very well-known poet, but had some kind of chronic illness and was more or less a recluse for a while when another young poet named Robert Browning read her work and basically wrote her a letter that was half a fan letter and half a marriage proposal. And and they became friends and then did actually get married. And she wrote the sonnet sequence over the course of kind of their courtship, and it is so beautiful. It starts with her kind of like, why are you in love with me? He was much younger. She just like didn't get it. Then you see her kind of transform over the course of their courtship to their marriage till she is just like, wow, this love thing is great. I love watching that progression. I love watching that transition. If you're looking for a classic poem by a woman, Victorian, that tells a story, I would recommend Goblin Market by Christina Rosetti. This is a really interesting story about two sisters, one of whom goes to the Goblin Market and tastes the fruit there, and how her sister has to basically save her from dying. It's very interesting. Any romantic poet is also a good one to try, because one of the things that defines the romantic idea about what poetry was supposed to be is that it was supposed to be clear and understandable. The romantics are often talking about nature again, and also about just like expressing their feelings, and so I think those two things actually make them pretty comprehensible. Sometimes you have to read sort of carefully because they were writing in the early 1800s and the late 1700s, and so their language is just a little bit older. It's kind of like the language of Jane Austen, but it's not so complicated that you can't really understand it. So William Wordsworth is one of these poets. I mentioned his poem about daffodils. It's called I Wander Lonely as a Cloud, and he's a really interesting poet just generally, and he wrote a ton of stuff. And as long as you don't pick up one of his like really long poems, really anything that you read is interesting. Samuel Taylor Coleridge was a friend of Wordsworth's, and he also wrote some really interesting stuff, including the kind of weird and sort of gothic Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is a long narrative poem. Coleridge was just an interesting person in general, and he kind of suffered a lot. Some of it was his own fault, but some of it wasn't. And so his poetry, I think, has some depth sometimes that some of the romantics don't. Another romantic is Lord Byron. Byron was like the hot writer of his day. And I mean hot in like the sells well, and also hot in the like everybody swooned over him kind of way. I mean, that's Byron. I have read a lot of Byron's poetry. A lot of it is very long, and so that keeps people from reading more than like She Walks in Beauty, which is actually kind of a boring poem. But I would encourage you to pick up a collection of Byron's work and just like read through it. You don't even have to read like through the long poems. He wrote a lot of gothic stuff, which is really good. Vampires and corsairs and mysterious things happening. And he also just has a great sense of humor. He could be really snarky, especially about his contemporary poets and just about things in general, and some of my favorite poems are ones like that. One of his poems, it's called Written After Swimming from Sestos to Abydos, which was actually a pretty big feat. It's in the Aegean Sea, and basically he swam from Italy to Greece. He writes this poem comparing himself to the great hero Lysander, except then he undermines that comparison by pointing out that he's more ordinary but maybe more sensible, and it's a really enjoyable, just short poem. Percy Shelley is not my favorite, and his poetry can be kind of complex, but if you're for the like super romantic, emotional, go for it. A romantic female poet is Emily Bronte. She wrote quite a lot of poetry, and again, her poetry is very emotional and kind of like feelings and nature. But if you've read Wuthering Heights and you liked Wuthering Heights, maybe try her poetry. Moving further back, we're gonna skip some centuries because for a while the poetry was, in my humble opinion, kind of dull. And this is an intro to poetry, and we don't want no boring poetry. So we're gonna move back to the 1600s, and I'm gonna recommend George Herbert. Herbert wrote a lot of stuff. This is some of it. He's most famous for a sequence called The Temple, where he kind of examines his faith in a lot of different lenses, and it's really beautiful. Herbert is a metaphysical poet, and the metaphysical poets were doing more complicated, tricky things with language. So if you read a poem of Herbert's and you're like, huh, that's, yeah. But I think it's really worth it, and if you kind of puzzle through what he's trying to say, then it becomes really valuable and interesting. If you want to get a taste for his poetry in a poem that's pretty understandable, his poem Prayer 1 is a good place to start. And finally, I couldn't make a video about poetry without talking about Shakespeare. I think that of the Renaissance poets, I mean, Shakespeare is, his language is old, so you have to work a little bit harder at it. But the other good thing about that is that, like, this is the Folger Shakespeare sonnets, and it is written like the Folger Shakespeare plays, where there's a lot of notes explaining what's going on in each poem. So that can be very helpful. Just find an edition with good notes that'll tell you what all of the like old-fashioned words that you probably don't know mean, and suddenly it becomes a lot clearer. Shakespeare's sonnets are very famous because Shakespeare, and I think that they're well worth reading. Sonnet 116. A sonnet sequence is usually numbered, so a poet writes a series of sonnets exploring maybe like a consistent theme or talking about love, and he numbers the sonnet sequence. So Shakespeare wrote 156 sonnets, and so we call them by their number. Sonnet 116 is the let me not to the marriage of true minds and impediments, love is not love, which alters when an alteration finds, etc. And that one is quoted a lot, like for weddings and stuff, and I like that one a lot. But there are some other really good ones in here. There are some ones that are quite funny, there are ones that are quite serious. He thinks about love, but also about age, and just kind of about life. So those were my recommendations, and I maybe talked more about them than I wanted to. I will write a list down in the description of all of the poems that I mentioned, so that you don't have to like try to remember them all. Most of the ones that I threw out there should be available online. How do you decide what kinds of poems you want to read? Honestly, despite that whole list that I just gave you, my best recommendation is to just go to a bookstore and stand in the poetry section and pull stuff off the shelf. The nice thing about poems is that unless they're like long narrative poems that tell a story, they're really short. They might be a page long. So the kind of buy-in time to trying an author's work is much lower. Poetry does require you to be attentive and to stay focused for the length of the poem. So just keep that in mind, that a quick skim is not going to be enough to give you the idea of the poet. A close read will only take you 2 or 3 or 5 minutes, depending on how long the poem is. And so again, it's still, even if you are really focused and really attentive and you stand there in the bookstore and you read one poem by a bunch of poets, it's not going to take you an enormously long time. And then if you like something, just go with that one. Poetry in that way is the same as fiction. If you like a book, read it, right? Same thing with poetry. If you like a work by an author, keep reading more of that. As I kind of hinted at the beginning, I think sometimes in high school we overcomplicate poetry or make it sound really bad because we are reading poems that are more complicated and trying to help students gather the tools to equip them to unpack a more complex piece of poetry. But because we do that and we don't just read poetry for fun, we make it sound like all of the poetry is really complicated and hard and dumb and whatever. And so I think that's a big part of the reason that people are kind of like about poetry. Just read a lot of poems. Another good way to try a lot of different poems is to find a poetry collection. I know Garrison Keillor has a series of poetry collections that are just like good poems or whatever, and they are from a broad range of people and a broad range of places and times, and a lot of times they're organized according to themes, so you can just kind of like dip in and dip out as you want. So that can be a good way, if you're not familiar with poetry, to try a lot of different writers and then just kind of pay attention to the ones that you really like, search more out about them. Also, like I said, a lot of poems, even the ones that are still out under copyright and out of the public domain, you can read online because they were published in, you know, newspapers or magazines or something. So that's also a good way to try somebody's work. If you're curious about an author, just Google their name, or even like check Amazon, because if there's a Kindle book version of the poetry book available, you can look inside and usually read a poem or two. And so that's another way that you can kind of try before you buy. So If you have any poems that you particularly like or poets that you particularly like, definitely share them in the comments. Let's get a broader list going. I honestly know less about poetry than I probably should, but I thought I would kind of just share this video as maybe a way to just give you some ideas, some names, some places to start, even if you decide that you don't want to read any of these poets. Just that tip about going to the bookstore and reading a poem or two, or picking up a volume of collected poems that deal with a lot of different things can maybe be the tip that you needed to give you an in to start reading more poetry. I think reading poetry is enormously rewarding. I'm gonna finish this with a recommendation for a book about poetry. This is Edwin Hirsch's How to Read a Poem and Fall in Love with Poetry. Edward Hirsch is himself a poet and I think a poetry teacher. He taught creative writing, and so he knows how to teach about writing poetry but also about understanding poetry, and this is it's not an enormously long book about reading poetry. And so if you want to go beyond just picking up a poem and kind of reading it, you want to understand more, or you want something that will help you tackle some of the more challenging poems that I have mentioned, then maybe check this book out. Anyway, let me know in the comments if you found any of these things helpful, and if you recommend anything for reading poetry or any poets that you would like to recommend. I'd love to hear them. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!